Audio lecture for World History, Unit 4, Gunpowder Empires in the East. This is during the Middle Ages.
Now we begin this by discussing how Islam spread with Turkish migrations during the post-classical era. So some of this is review, and this is before we get to the Gunpowder Empires. So what we're going to be discussing is the Delhi Sultanate in India in particular. In the 700s, Muslims had conquered the Indus River Valley in order to increase control of the Indian Ocean trade routes. We discussed a bit of this in earlier units. By the 1000s, Muslims, led by Mahmud of Ghazni, invaded India, spreading Islam and plundering as they went. India was very weak after the fall of the Gupta Empire. By the late 1100s, Muslims had conquered most of the Hindu kingdoms in the northern part of India and created what became known as the Delhi Sultanate. The capital city was at Delhi, and that's why it was called the Delhi Sultanate. The word sultanate basically just meant kingdom. Sultans were initially of Persian, Afghan, Turkic, or mixed descent, but the Delhi Sultanate was the first Islamic state in India. Islam spread throughout northern India as a result of this. Hindu and Buddhist temples and statues were destroyed by the invading Muslims. Islam was spread initially and mostly by merchants and the Sufi mystics. The Sufi mystics were a branch of Islam that claimed magic and healing powers were part of their belief system. And the Islam appealed to the Indians of the lower castes in northern India because Islam did not recognize a caste system. So, needless to say, that would be appealing to those lower caste Indians. Despite Muslim rule, Hinduism continued to flourish in India, but Buddhism dwindled significantly. High caste Hindus, who barely tolerated Muslim rule, worked in the government, served in the Sultan's army, and engaged in profitable trade. They had a kind of understanding with the system since they were the higher castes. They were the ones that were chosen for those high positions, even though religiously they did not really care for the Muslims. Islam and Hinduism were so different that there was no real syncretism that took place. India's elites rejected Islam as a religion, unlike in Africa, where the elites ended up incorporating Islam into their own belief systems, creating a syncretic religion or a blending cultural diffusion. Muslims submit to one God, as we know from previous units, and they stress the equality of the believers in the eyes of Allah, which of course goes against the caste system. Okay, Hindus are polytheistic with a rigid caste system. So it's very difficult for these two religions to have any kind of blending because they're so diametrically opposed. Muslims did not adopt Indian food, dress, art, or architecture. They also did not adopt the low status of women that the Indian caste system emphasized. The Delhi Sultanate had little power in central and southern India, however. Most of their power was concentrated in the northern part of India. In southern India, the Hindu rulers remained in power. So there will not be a united southern India. There are many different Hindu kingdoms instead. The first gunpowder empire we're going to discuss is probably the most powerful and long lasting one, the Ottoman Empire. In 1299, Osman, who was the leader of the nomadic Sunni Muslim Turks, settled in Anatolia. That was modern day Turkey. It was the old Asia Minor territory from the ancient world. By doing this, he established a new empire called the Ottoman Empire. There is Osman. By the time we get to 1453, some of Osman's descendants had expanded the empire. Mehmed the Conqueror is probably the most significant. Mehmed, or sometimes Mehmet, is with a T on the end instead of a D. Both are considered correct. Mehmed was the one responsible for finally conquering the city of Constantinople, forcing the end of the Byzantine Empire. He used huge cannons to break through the city walls and finally lay siege to the city. Constantinople will be renamed Istanbul and would remain the capital of the Ottoman Empire until 1922, when the Ottoman Empire was dismantled after World War I. The Ottoman Empire will, for almost 400 years, be a very powerful gunpowder empire. The Sultan was the title or name for Ottoman rulers. Sultan Selim conquered Mecca and Medina and took the title of Caliph as a descendant of Mehmed. The title was unused since the Mongol Empire, the title of Caliph. He will renew that title. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who reigned from 1520 to 1566, extended the empire even more, all the way into Mesopotamia and into the Balkan Peninsula in Eastern Europe. Suleiman the Magnificent was very much a threat to Europe with this. And what's going on in Europe at this particular time is the Protestant Reformation. One of the reasons, many historians agree, that one of the reasons why the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Charles V, was not able to stop Luther's Reformation in those Germanic territories is because he was otherwise occupied with fighting against Suleiman's troops on his southern border. 1526 to 1529, we see a period of Ottoman expansion being halted. It was halted at the Battle of Vienna that goes on and off through that 3-year period. The Battle of Vienna, however, let the Ottomans remain a threat to Western Europe for centuries. They were halted, yes, at the Battle of Vienna, but they were not pushed back from where they had already spread. So as you can see on this map here, the Ottoman lands were all the way into Hungary. And they would remain there for quite some time, putting pressure on the Habsburg lands, which of course were part of the Holy Roman Empire. The Ottoman Empire peaked under Suleiman the Magnificent. The empire spread from the Balkans all the way to the Arabian Peninsula and Persia, including the Mediterranean and Black Seas. The Ottoman Empire was one of the wealthiest empires in all of the world during this time period, maybe second only to the Spanish Empire as it was expanding into the New World. Geographically and culturally, the Ottoman Empire linked Europe, Africa, and Asia, kind of like the Mongol Empire had linked it earlier. This included Christian, Jewish, and Muslim faiths all throughout these regions. Suleiman the Magnificent created the Devshirme system. Jevshirmi, I think is how you pronounce it. It was a system of conscription of Christian boys from the Balkans region. Most of them were Eastern Orthodox Christian, forcing them to convert to Islam, and then training and using them as soldiers. This Jevshirmi system eventually created these soldiers known as Janissaries. Janissaries could not wear beards as free Muslims did. It showed that they were subjects to the Muslim rulers, and they could not marry. Now, after 1566, they changed that rule. But they were ultra loyal and saw the Sultan as a father. Many historians believe the training of the Janissary troops, the reason why they took them at such a young age was so they could indoctrinate them. By the time they were old enough to serve, they were brainwashed, if you will, or indoctrinated to believe that they were saved from some horrible existence before they were taken by the Muslims, and they served the emperor or the sultan, seeing them as their father. These Christian slave soldiers, if you will, the Janissaries, could over time attain elite status in the empire through their actions or through their merit. The Devshirmi system allowed for social mobility, and many families competed for honor ultimately through this system. The Devshirmi system allowed sultans to control local Turkish leaders. Janissaries got most of the positions in the bureaucracy as a result. In other words, they were trusted more because since they had been indoctrinated since they were small children, it was seen that they could be trusted more by the sultans. In 1683, the Devshirmi was abolished. That system was abolished after a series of Janissary revolts, which had been rare beforehand. Janissaries ultimately had become, by that point, so trusted that a series of weaker sultans had basically allowed those Janissaries to control the sultanate. Eventually, there will be a stronger sultan that will have to break the back of this system to try to start over. Suleiman restructured the Ottoman legal system. The Ottomans ultimately called him the lawgiver as a result. He recodified the legal system throughout the Ottoman Empire. Much like Justinian had recodified the law in the early Byzantine Empire, taking old Roman law and updating it. Here's a quote from a historian who specialized in Suleiman. Not only was he a great military campaigner, a man of the sword, as his father and great-grandfather had been before him, he differed from them in the extent to which he was also a man of the pen. He was a great legislator, standing out in the eyes of his people as a high-minded sovereign and a magnanimous exponent of justice. He codified a system of laws dealing with cases not covered by the Sharia law that they lived in accordance with, and required government officials to study the Islamic law so they could have precedents set and they would have a more stable legal system. The Ottomans used beys, which are called provincial governors, who were responsible for collecting taxes, and they held administrative and military control over small tribes and villages. They were provincial governors that were under the authority of the Sultan ultimately, and they answered back to the Sultan. They were the local governors. Beys received fiefdoms, kind of like the nobles had in Europe during the Middle Ages. They received fiefdoms in exchange for military support that they pledged to the Sultan. This created a hierarchy of authority in the empire, with the Sultan with the most power. Sultans were assisted by a chief minister called a vizier. Viziers, kind of like viceroys and other bureaucrats, often were drawn from the Devshirme system. If any of you recall watching Aladdin earlier this semester, you will remember that Jafar was a vizier. So this is a position that had been around in the Islamic system for a while. In the early 1500s, the Ottomans lost control over the Indian Ocean trade routes to the Portuguese. This happened, of course, after the Portuguese had expanded, creating themselves a trading post empire. They had gone all the way around the coast of Africa into the Indian Ocean to reach India, and they now controlled the Indian Ocean trade network. Just remember, though, that within a generation, the Portuguese will lose control over that Indian Ocean trade network, and the Spice Islands. They will lose control over it, and it will become part of the Dutch system instead. In 1571, the Ottomans lost a big battle. The Battle of Lepanto was a naval battle against Philip II of Spain for the control of the Mediterranean Sea. This loss will allow for the growth of Spain's influence and power within Europe in the late 1500s. However, shortly after this, Philip will lose a key battle against Queen Elizabeth I in England with the destruction of his Spanish Armada. So this victory will be significant for him, but it will not last 20 years. He will not be able to stay on top more than 20 more years. By the mid 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was showing signs of decline. They had lost some of their trade routes to the Portuguese, to the Spanish. They had lost too much territory to others. Their empire was shrinking. There were peasant revolts going on. There was corruption in the government. All of the things that we have seen happen to other previous empires throughout history. A series of weak rulers, etc. The second of the gunpowder empires we're going to discuss is the Svavid Empire. In 1501, Ismail, who was the leader of the nomadic Shia Muslim Turks, settled in Persia, which is modern-day Iran, and established what would become known as the Svavid Empire. So Ismail, the leader of the new Svavid Empire. The Svavid leaders were influenced greatly by the branch of Islam known as Sufi. The Sufi mystics had rejected worldly pleasures and possessions, favoring a life dedicated to Allah, and the attempt to reach Allah and reach union with Him mystically through a series of whirling around. We talked way back at the beginning of the year when we talked about world religions. We talked about the whirling dervishes. Those whirling dervishes were Sufi Muslims. Shah was the name of the Svavid leaders. Okay, so the title of king or emperor was Shah in the Svavid Empire, like we had Sultan in the Ottoman Empire. So the Shah Ismail created this gunpowder empire. He did not tolerate Sunnis, and he rigidly enforced Shia traditions and laws. Now remember, the Shia Muslims were the minority Muslim group. And so this is a big shift away from what we had seen in earlier Islamic empires. The Twelver Shias revere the descendants of Muhammad, the Imams, and believe the hidden Imam, the 12th descendant, will one day reappear to rule over all. In 1514, the Ottoman-Svavid conflicts began as the Ottomans defeated Ismail at the Battle of Chaldiran. The Sunni and Shia split was very strong, and remember, the Ottomans were Sunni and the Svavids were Shia. Ismail's Kizilbash, or redhead soldiers, were armed with swords, and they were defeated by the Ottoman Janissaries, who were armed with guns and cannons. The Battle of Chaldiran demonstrated the importance of gunpowder technology in land-based empires and limited the Shia expansion. In 1588 to 1629, under a new Shah, Shah Abbas I, the Svavid Empire will finally reach its peak. Largely, this is because they had adopted more gunpowder technology and were able to maintain control over their territories as a result. Abbas ordered Russian boys that were captured, since they bordered southern Russia. These Russian boys would be captured, forced to convert to Islam, and trained as slave infantrymen. This surpassed the power of the Qizilbash that we had seen earlier. This is similar to creating janissaries like the Ottomans had done. These instead were just called slave infantrymen. Shah Abbas reorganized the army for the Svavid Empire, introducing guns and cannons, as well as bringing in mercenaries from England to help train his troops. This drove the Ottomans out of the Svavid territories. Svavids with the severed heads of Ottoman soldiers are seen in the image. Shah Abbas hoped to eradicate the Sunni sect of Islam completely by forcing conquered people to become Shia Muslim instead of remaining Sunni. The Ottoman-Svavid conflicts, however, will maintain that division. It will define some of the boundaries and Islamic divisions in the Middle East to this very day. The Sunni-Shia split will remain. And if you look at this map here, you see how much of the Islamic world today is Sunni and how much is Shia. The Shia areas are predominantly the areas that had been under the control of the Svavid Empire earlier, since they were a Shia gunpowder empire. The Svavids controlled local Turkish leaders by granting them fiefdoms with peasants to work the land if they paid tribute. The Turks attained powerful positions in the empire that threatened the Svavid power, so later Shahs relied on Persians in their bureaucracy. Instead of Turks, they preferred Persians later on. The capital of Isfahan, I am sorry for the pronunciation, Isfahan, was famous for beautiful architecture, but the city was located far inland, far away from the sea-based trade routes that transformed the world. There's where it's located, right in the center of the Svavid Empire, very much landlocked. By 1722, the Svavid Empire collapsed as severity of Shah Hussein's rule led to revolt among many of the Sunni Afghans that were under his control. Afghans meaning from Afghanistan. Now we're going to talk about the third of the gunpowder empires, the Mughal dynasty in India. By 1526, the Mughal, which were Mongols from Turkestan, you remember we talked before about a Mughal that was related to the Mongols. It was Tamerlane, remember? Anyways, the Mughal leader by 1526 was Babur, and he conquered Afghanistan as well as the Delhi Sultanate, creating a gunpowder empire in India. Babur was seen as a descendant of Tamerlane. Shah Akbar the Great, who reigned from 1556 to 1605, conquered most of northern India. He believed that any empire that was not expanding was ultimately in decline. So, this idea that you could never have enough, you needed to keep expanding, was what drove his empire building. Akbar ended extra tax on non-Muslims, that jizya that we had talked about in the Islamic lecture several units ago. He also stopped the pilgrimage tax on Hindus and was tolerant of all faiths. This will ultimately win him a lot of support in the Mughal Empire. Even the Hindus would recognize his authority, even though he was of a different religion, because he did not, heavily tax them just for being Hindus. Akbar invented what was known as the divine faith, which was an attempt to combine Muslim, Hindu, Zoroastrian, Christian, and Sikh beliefs. This would be a major kind of cultural diffusion, this syncretism, but this divine faith idea was not very successful because too many differences existed between many of those faiths. And so a blending did not really pan out to be very successful. But he tried. Many Hindu leaders, Rajas was what they were called, served in the bureaucracy in Akbar's empire. Akbar allowed Hindus to use their own laws rather than follow the Muslim Sharia. This shows his toleration, and this was one of the reasons why, even though they differed in faith, the Hindus did not oppose the governance of Akbar, because he was tolerant and allowed them to rule themselves, not force them to accept the Muslim Sharia law. The Mughals created what was known as the zamindari system. Zamindars were local government officials who collected taxes and upheld the laws for the Mughals. They had to pay those taxes to the Mughals, not a jizya, just regular taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, those kinds of things. And they followed the general laws, not the ones just based in Sharia, but the general laws when it came to governance for the Mughals. And it was a kind of bureaucracy where the local officials were allowed to have some sort of say in how they were governed, even though ultimately they are under the power of the Mughal emperor. Shah Jahan conquered the Deccan Plateau in central India and turned back Portuguese invasion of Bengal. This was a big deal because this allowed for the Mughal Empire to maintain a prominence in the Bay of Bengal trade that was going on and force the Portuguese out. Shah Jahan moved the capital from Agra to Delhi. And he built a magnificent palace there called the Red Fort with its famed peacock throne. Here's the peacock throne. Shah Jahan also famously built the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal was actually built by Jahan to commemorate the memory of his wife who had died and display the wealth and power of the Mughal Empire. It is still one of the most visited shrines in the world. And if you go to Epcot and ride Soarin', you see the Taj Mahal. I can always bring it back to Disney, folks. Shah Jahan's military conquests and building projects forced him to raise taxes. It costs money to do such things. From one third of crop's value to a half of a crop's value was what he increased the taxes. That's a good chunk of increase in taxation. Jahan's empire was massive, but high taxes and a rollback of Akbar's religious reforms and his more tolerant ways led to the fragmentation of Jahan's empire, of the Mughal Empire. Europeans by that point had started to expand into India. First the Dutch, then the British, well, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British. And that will also fragment the Mughal Empire